Hi, everyone. My name is Jen. I'm with innerworkcoaching.life. I also do the Mindful Insights blog and podcast. And so, wherever you're watching or listening to this from, welcome if you're new, welcome back if you're familiar. I wanted to take a few minutes today and give a shout out to Tina T, who left a comment asking specifically for more information about developing your patience with children, and kind of, as she put it, not put our shit on them, which is something that I've been figuring out over the last several years because I used to be an alcoholic, and I grew up in a narcissistic environment. So it was a very, very weird and um, emotionally challenging experience to get out of that state of wanting to escape all the time and into actually living life. Because during this time, I was also, I wasn't agoraphobic necessarily, maybe a little bit, but I didn't like to leave the house, you know. I didn't have, I didn't have the confidence. I didn't have any faith in myself anymore, you know. And there was a lot playing into that, which is why I kind of discuss things a little bit vaguely, and only give examples for what's relevant, because what happened doesn't matter as much as the energy behind it. And we can all tap into and sense the energies of our own situation and our own environment and our own people that are around us. See what I'm saying? It's unique to each of us, although there are very, very, very many common threads. So I hope that makes sense. So, one of the first and most amazing things that helped me, which was brought to my attention by a dear friend and client, Henriette Christensen. She's also an author from Denmark, and we're probably going to be doing some conversations together on the channel sometime soon because she does self-help also and self-love. So a couple of years ago, I think, my sense of time is kind of weird, so it might have been give or take a couple months, whatever. But she said, you know, you can choose to be amused rather than annoyed. And the first thing that popped into my head was my kids. You know, they're sitting there. They were still pretty young at the time, you know, and they're sitting there and they're bickering all the time and arguing and fighting and whatever. And all that tension comes from somewhere, you know. It's an underlying energy, right? So the second because we're the adults, right? We're the parents, it's up to us. We cannot put the responsibility of this stuff, this emotional work, and us bettering ourselves onto our children, right? And there could be other things that play into it. For example, um, I had a time period where I was very, very hyper aware that choosing not to have an abortion could come with resentment of my child, subconscious resentment. Okay. Because I was living out of a programmed belief, religious belief, that abortion is murder, right? And while I still don't necessarily agree with it in all circumstances, it's not my place to say whether it's the right thing for someone or not, right? So, um, I knew that with that being an option, a legal, you know, option, that I really had to think about how my decision was going to affect me and my child long term, right? Because if I feel like I'm forced into having a child, then that can build resentment if those beliefs are not my actual beliefs, right? And that resentment can build up subconsciously, and it shows up in our behavior toward our children. It shows up whether we are aware of it or not, right? So, and it can show up in our treatment of other people too, not just our children. So, and these ideas are kind of universal. Like you can choose to be amused rather than annoyed in most situations. You know, I mean, if there's real danger, obviously you don't want to sit there cackling in a corner. You know what I mean? But you know, you can take it as it comes without freaking out about it, right? So, um, it was funny because the same day that, this comment was left on my YouTube, I went and I had some errands to run and some running around to do and whatever, and I ended up talking with a friend of mine who I've known for a long time and, who has been going through quite a lot also, um, and we got on the topic of you know inner work and working on yourself and working on you know not yelling at the kids and being more patient and being amused rather than annoyed and she pointed out to me something that's like totally priceless. She goes, you know, I never realized that the kids joke around and are smartasses just like we are, you know, and especially if they see that as the sense of humor, then they're gonna want to participate because it's fun and it's funny and they want to be funny too, you know. So, however, a lot of times when kids try and joke around, it's taken as disrespect. So this is where it really comes in, like choosing to be amused rather than annoyed and figuring out, is my kid joking around with me having fun? You know what I mean? And it's a lot easier to keep yourself from taking things too personally when you start doing this practice of choosing amusement rather than annoyance. And it helps you to start seeing your children or children in general as little individuals. You know, they are, they have complex lives just like we do. They go to school, they have lives outside the home, they have their own friends, they get input constantly, just like we do, you know, and they're always integrating it and they're constantly learning. So, helping them to learn rather than trying to fit them into a mold, right? Rather than directing their thoughts or trying to direct how they see things, working with them to guide them, right? Allowing them to ask questions they're curious about. Um, that's another point that I wanted to make is let kids ask questions. It gets so obnoxious. I know, believe me. And when you're, it's especially difficult when you're a single parent and you're working and your time is just monopolized. You know what I mean? Um, or if you're, even if you're in a traditional kind of family and both parents have to work to make ends meet, you know, it can be challenging to make the time to answer 5 billion questions that us as adults, we as adults think of as kind of like, oh gosh, oh my gosh, this is so obnoxious and dumb, you know, and that's kind of how we see it. But where else are they going to learn from? Who else are they going to ask? You know what I mean? Like, I ended up asking everybody else because I couldn't get any real answers, you know. My sex talk consisted of, it's bad, don't do it. You know, so I'm like, okay, thanks. You know, if it's so terrible, then why is everybody all like, woohoo, you know? And so I had to go out and find out more information for myself. Now, I realized and understood that educating my children and being open with them was going to be important. And then I went to extremes because then I started way oversharing. And while they've always been fairly mature for their age, it probably was not necessary to go that far, you know? And this is an example of how we often think and behave in extremes. And that has to do with our emotions, with steadying our emotional wobble and coming to a center point, a center where it's calm, where you can kind of look at both extremes and say, okay, what can I take that's, you know, beneficial and constructive from each part, from each side, from each extreme, and kind of mellow it out a little bit to where I can bring it together and it can work for me, you know? And this center point might be different for everyone, you know. You don't want to be this emotionless zombie, of course, you know, and that's not what coming to a center point means. It doesn't mean that you lose your passion or that you're some numbed out freak all of a sudden, you know, that you're just wandering around. All the contrary, it's when you come to your point of alignment, when you really start looking at how conditioning has affected you, then you can start to see how your conditioning is affecting your children. And all you got to do is put yourself in their place, right? If if your kid comes to you and asks you, "Hey, what's a Ouija board and how does it work?" Do you freak out and say, "Oh my God, don't ever talk about that again"? Do you take a second and say, "Well, I don't really know that much about it, so maybe we should research together and find out more and see what it's all about"? Or do you kind of send them off on their own, you know, like, "Well, I don't know. Why don't you tell me?" You know? I mean, all of those are options, right? And there's countless others, I'm sure, of ways to respond to this kind of a question. But when you respond to especially questions that make you uncomfortable by shutting down the topic of conversation and not educating your child or allowing them to educate themselves, because when you shut it down like that and they sense your fear around that topic, which is what happened to me, anything tarot cards, Wicca, pagan, you know, anything I wanted to know that wasn't Catholic was evil, right? And I sensed that fear. And so I grew up being scared shitless of everything. I couldn't even go down the playground slide without freaking out. You know what I mean? Because I was raised to be fearful. And this included being fearful of asking questions, being discouraged from asking questions without people understanding that that's what they were doing. So now, before I reply to my children in any way whatsoever, especially if they bring me something tough, right? I think about how is it, how would it make me feel if my parents responded to me the way I'm about to respond? Put yourself back in their shoes for a minute. They say my teenagers are kind of weird. You know, they have a lot of grown up friends. They always have. We've always hung out with older people. I have too. Um, but people talk a lot of crap about teenagers. And that's always bothered me because I remember when I was a teenager being like, you know what? Fuck you. I didn't even do anything wrong. And you're telling me I'm a piece of shit. What the hell? You know? And, um, and this is conditioning. This is programming bad behavior patterns into teenagers because when you're constantly told you're a fuck up, you're like, well, I might as well go be one then because I'm getting all the punishment without any of the pleasure of the crime. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell? So, this is the thinking, this is the logic. I remember this. I remember this very well. I have journals full of thoughts from when I was growing up, you know? My entire teenage life is documented. Um, I should ooh, I wonder if I should do that. How would you guys feel about me reading some of my journal entries? I've been kind of thinking about going back through them anyway to see what I can learn, to see um, if I can make any connections and do more, you know, inner work kind of mindfulness revelation videos based on that. If that's something that you're interested in, just let me know. There's a lot of poetry and stuff in there and various different things, song lyrics, stories, weird little stories, prose, all kinds of stuff, pictures. Um, anyway, but one of the ways that I kind of use to figure out how to respond is by putting myself back in their position, or at least trying to. You know what I mean? Um, so last summer, my oldest was 15. She went to a birthday party. And and then later I get a message, or a call or something, and people are freaking out and they're like, "Oh, they were drinking and I'm going to bring her home and we're going to cancel the party and what have you, right?" So, um I was waiting, and my daughter comes in and she's all flushed, you know, and she comes in and she's like, "Mom, I want you to know I drank 3 beers and I don't regret it." And then she walks off. She was 15 at the time. And I'm sitting here and I'm like, "Okay, fair enough." She kind of goes and hides a little bit, and her friend's mom comes in and tells me, what she found out happened, and I was like, "Okay, I'm going to talk to my daughter and we'll figure it out, I'm sure it'll be fine, and so I talked to her about it and I got kind of the story of the situation. And in my opinion, her being the one to drink all 3 beers that they had, which isn't really that much, um, it was probably the best way that things could have worked out. After she explained the situation to me and kind of told me some stuff that was going on, and kind of some of the impressions that she was getting, because we always talk about vibes, I know that my oldest is an empath. She's told me as much. She says that she can kind of choose whether she taps into someone's feelings or not, which is really good because that took me forever to figure out how to do. And the fact that she's only 16 and she knows how, well, that's beautiful. I'm not going to stunt her emotional growth from here on out, like my parents did mine. I'm going to um, continue to help her grow and help guide her and help, give her my feedback and input, but let her ultimately make her own decisions. And I have a theory that life punishes you enough with consequences. I'm not really a huge dole out punishment kind of parent. Um, if you teach your children how to learn from their mistakes by paying attention to their lives rather than just telling them what to do, because then their only motivation for doing the right thing is to not get in trouble, see? And and these are all things that like we fall into without even consciously realizing it, we got to forgive ourselves for that and then just try again the next day, you know um I think this is the last thing that I wanted to touch on is focusing on the positive and appreciation rather than focusing on and nitpicking mistakes or like oversights or whatever it might be, right? So, and there's a balance to be struck here, because and I have not completely struck this balance myself, because one of my biggest threat to my children these days is, do I need to turn into an Aggie bitch again? Because I really don't want to, but if you don't do what I ask you when I say so nicely, then it's very frustrating for me, and so that's like, I remind them, you know that we all have to work together, and that in order for that to happen, we've all got to be kind of paying attention and making sure that if we see something needs to be done and we have a minute to do it, then we just do it. The housework is one of the biggest, most ridiculously stressful aspects of cohabitating with other human beings, be they children or whoever, or roommates or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? Um, you really have to be aware of yourself and remember to do what you're supposed to do. If people don't have clear cut, quote unquote, jobs, or there's no real like schedules or systems or whatever in place, then it can be more challenging. So these are all things to keep in mind. But my daughter and I were talking the other day, and she was telling me about, how she would clean the house back when we were still living at the old place, and how I would hone in and focus on like the one thing that she didn't do, or the one thing that she didn't do, quote unquote, right, And then I used to have a real problem with certain things, like the way the dishwasher was loaded and the way the towels were folded and the way the linens were folded and things like that. And I had to work at getting past the OCD aspect, right? And rather than griping and complaining at people for doing it wrong, I shifted my focus to be grateful that it's even getting done, period, that I don't have to do it. You see what I mean? And that's all perception. It's all consciousness. And we have the power to change that within ourselves. So if you find, or if you catch yourself focusing in on nitpicking little things, you know what I mean? And we all do this from time to time. It's not inherently a bad thing. It's just, you know think about, take into consideration, especially where there's kids concerned, you know um how do you feel when someone's constantly beating you down and picking apart everything you do, making you feel like you can't do anything right? Have you ever been in that situation where somebody's just bitch, 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 bitch? You know what I mean? You can choose to focus on those nitpicky, stressful, frustrating things, right? Or you can choose to focus on the positive aspects. And there are positive aspects to everything. There is a silver lining to everything. I don't care what the situation is, you can extract goodness and positivity and happiness and joy from little moment to moment situations. You know what I mean? Moment to moment things. Um, that can be done by practicing appreciation more, gratitude. Um, it feels a lot easier to complain about the things that are wrong if you're in that habit. But once you start kind of shifting, into seeing the things that you can be grateful for instead, you end up looking back and seeing kind of like, wow, you know, the balance of quote unquote good things and bad things happening is usually pretty similar, right? There's crazy life stuff all the time. We are always presented with challenges to overcome. Anyway, what's happened for me is I end up looking back and I'm like, nothing's really changed except for the way that I see things. Um, I mean, things have changed, the outside starts to adjust itself to how you feel in here. And it continues to do that. So as you kind of go back and forth, and this is the wobble again, um, which positive and negative extremes, right? The emotional ups and downs, the roller coaster aspect. Um, you start to center yourself, because instead of being caught up in all the problems and trying to effort your way through and solve them, you will start getting caught up in creativity and positivity and growth. And you will start to really see that it's not about what happens to you or what happens in your life or what your circumstances, you know. There are stressors everywhere. There are good and bad aspects to every single lifestyle. There are good and bad aspects to being poor. There are good and bad aspects to being rich. There are good and bad aspects even to being sick, you know. You have to figure out for yourself what it is you're choosing to focus on and whether the suffering that you're putting yourself through on any level is worth the return that you get from dealing with the suffering, right? So when I first learned that I was going to become homeless, um, due to my parents changing the locks suddenly while I was house sitting without any warning, um, I started freaking out. I had no money. I had spent an entire like year almost building an online course that I was planning to launch, and then I got kicked out and everything got screwed up, you know? However, so I'm going to tell you what I learned from that. What I learned from that is that I'm capable of creating an online course, and that if I don't allow my external circumstances to deter me, then I will be capable of launching and completing and finally getting on my feet. You know what I mean? And I don't think that I would have had the confidence to create the course I'm creating now had I not created the previous course on self-publishing, which is also obsolete now because CreateSpace is no longer a thing. So really, it was a lesson and it would have flopped anyway within a couple of years. And so I'm like, this is probably not such a bad thing. Um, but yeah, I freaked out when I found out that we were gonna basically have nowhere to go. We ended up staying with some people who did not want us there, and or at least that's how they were behaving. And the energetic messages were very, very clear, you know. Um, After that experience, I started realizing that I was putting all this emotional energy into fighting, right? I was yelling and screaming and trying to get people's attention to help me because I didn't know where we were going to go. We were literally scouting out places to squat, me and my teenagers. Okay. We were scouting out abandoned buildings and spots in the woods and whatever else, you know? Scary, scary to have to consider. But we were at a point, and I was at a point. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this song. My Name is Human. Um, oh gosh, what is the name of the band? I can't remember. I'll link the video for it in the description because I really like this song. But he basically, at one point in the song, says, "I'm ready for love and I'm ready for war, and I've never felt this fucking ready before." And that was basically where I was at. I was like, you know what? I would rather live under a fucking bridge than have to put up with abuse on a daily basis, you know? Because I know that I knew or I sensed that there was going to be some crazy ass comeback story, you know? There's no way after everything that I have experienced in this life that something like this would defeat me. You know what I mean? There's no fucking way. There's no way. And while it was scary, it helped me to realize that all this running around and trying to solve problems, right? Because that wasn't the only problem we had. We had all sorts of issues. I called around, I tried to find places to park. There was nowhere available, right? Places that were available would only take like 2000 and newer, and our RV is a 1978 leaky and it has to have a tarp on it. You know what I mean? The hookups and stuff don't even work. So, or most of them, you know. And so it was like we had very, very limited choice. And there was a possibility that we were going to have to um, really, literally rough it for a while with no money, you know, and that I would have to go figure out a way to get to the library every day in order to work with an RV that doesn't start all the time, doesn't have any lights on it, you know, is a freaking monster to drive around. So these were the situations that I was faced with, you know. And as I made countless phone calls to domestic violence hotline, homeless shelters, state run programs, whatever I could find, I was told the same thing every time. There's nothing we can do for you. So I had a decision to make. I had to decide whether I was going to get out of this through making decisions based on fear and paranoia, or if I was going to get out of this by making decisions based on love and faith. And not long after that, the leap of faith came into play. And I was required, along with everyone else that's in this current situation, to make a total leap of faith and take a huge risk on people who were strangers. You know, were they going to be worse? You know, were they going to be dangerous? Were they going to take all of my money and then say, fuck you, get out? These were all possibilities. But I could not allow those thoughts to enter and control me. So I had to learn really, really quickly how to um, influence and direct my focus. So that way I'm not freaking out when there's problems to solve. Because guess what happened? The second I stopped and said, you know what? Something will come along, something will work out. I had like a week left, maybe. You know what I mean? And I just focused on working and packing and throwing stuff away and sorting and doing what I needed to do. And things worked out in a very convoluted, weird, roundabout, crazy kind of way. Things worked out and are continuing to work out. But I don't think that they would have worked out as well had I made a decision based on fear, you know? Had I made the decision, and you know what? Had I gotten here, had I landed here and still been in a total state of fear, you know, and continued to perpetuate it, then that would have turned out probably worse too. Um, the point being that if you're freaking out and you're putting all that fear energy into trying to solve a problem, then you're pushing the solution that's best further away rather than attracting it to you via faith, calmness, you know? And as far as children are concerned, trying to force anything is, it sends weird energy signals, you know? It sends signals that your actions are not based in love because kids can sense that. It sends signals that there's something else going on underneath because kids can sense that. And it sends signals underneath that life is something to be afraid of, that problems are something to be afraid of. Rather than seeing problems as big, scary things, I started looking at them as challenges, like in a video game, like you have certain missions to accomplish. You get like a list of things that you got to do, and then you just go and do them as you can. Sometimes it's very linear, and other times you're like off doing all sorts of crazy, weird stuff just to get this one thing done, right? I'm not a gamer, but I know that's how it works. And it's very similar. Don't overcomplicate it. It's just a metaphor. And when you start to look at things as challenges to be overcome rather than heavy problems to be solved or life is going to end, you know, it makes the whole journey a little lighter. Um, it's good to not take things so seriously, too seriously. And there's a lot that plays into that. I just recently did a video about worry and how worry is fear energy. And when we worry about things too much, we send that kind of self-curse energy into the future timelines of our lives and toward other people. So less worry and more opening yourself up to seeing the opportunities as they present themselves. Because there are always opportunities, right? And you will always have more than one opportunity to choose from, even if the situation seems dire, if you're going at it from a um, calmer perspective, a perspective of trying to attract solutions rather than force them, you know. And you can't be attached to one outcome. One of my options would have been to go to another state and park on someone's property, but I don't know if the RV would have made it. Another option would have been potentially to go find an intentional community, like a commune, and see if I could park there, but usually they want an investment, a fairly significant one. And so for me, there was really no solution. The solution came in the form of independent help from people who um, took just as much of a leap of faith as I did, if not more, you know? So these are all things to consider when we're talking about not putting our crap on our kids, you know? When we start to see how we have been programmed, right? And you can see this, it's if you think back on your childhood and remember like certain ways you were treated or things that were said to you repeatedly that kind of made you feel funny or didn't quite sit right, or something that was a repetitive kind of experience throughout your childhood that didn't feel quite right, that's a good place to start because then you can kind of see, okay, what message am I really sending by behaving this way, right? So one example that I'm going to use about really just considering wording, considering how we talk to our children, right? Like one of the things that is very typical of narcissists to say is you should be ashamed of yourself if you make a mistake or something, you know what I mean? Or if you do something wrong, you should be ashamed of yourself. What kind of message does that send to a child? You should be ashamed of yourself. They didn't know they were doing anything wrong. Isn't it more important to say, oh my gosh, that's not okay, you know? And here's why, rather than you should be ashamed of yourself. Because that, first of all, that tells you that what you just did represents you as a person, period. It integrates the feeling of I'm a fuck up, right? Which makes you easy to control. for the narcissist and keeps you in self-doubt and unworthiness, right? And it also sends the message that we should be ashamed of our humanity, which is not accurate. We have every right to be here. We are here for a reason. Do you really think that billions and billions of the same kind of being would pop up out of nowhere for no fucking reason? It doesn't make any sense. You know, big scheme of things. Come on. Let's think about this. We are all here for a reason. And I think that reason is to figure ourselves out. I think that reason is to figure out how to tap back in to the connection with God, with source energy, with unconditional love. All of this programming can be overcome by an individual. The individual is the only one who can overcome their own programming. This is what it means to empower yourself, to step into a mission of figuring out what's real underneath the bullshit belief systems. And we can all do that. I hope that my thought processes and kind of how I see things help you to make the connections too between experiences in life and how it can play out versus the emotional world that we all have within us. You know, once you can kind of connect these things, because that was my biggest issue, was this disconnect. You know, like I always felt like I had a soul. I always knew it was there. I always wanted, and usually when I was getting creative, writing poetry, writing music, in my journals, one of the things that I used to put either in the front cover or the back cover was puke, oops, there's my soul, you know, soul vomit. Soul Vomit ended up becoming an anthology about domestic violence because of that, you know, and I always knew, but there was always a disconnect, you know, in everyday life. It was like I could only tap in when I was being creative. And that's no longer the case. We can tap in anytime we want. And that's what it's all about, is figuring out how, via your habits and your behaviors, your everyday moment-to-moment life, how you can be as loving as you possibly can toward yourself and toward everyone and everything around you. You know, some of these things are hard to face, and it's okay. You know, it's all right. The funny thing is we all fall into these crappy habits sometimes. You know, it's important to forgive yourself and to understand that, you know, maybe this circumstance was meant to refine what I know about this. Maybe this was meant to really drive home the point, you know, the lesson. I hope that some of the things that I shared with you today help you to get a little bit more into a life of relaxing a little, having a little more fun, being less rigid, you know, less black and white thinking, less right and wrong, more how can we integrate this? How can we work with this? Right? All right. I hope that resonates with you guys, and I hope that you're having an awesome weekend. Again, thank you, Tina T, for your fantastic comment. And this whole video was inspired by that and like synchronicities from yesterday. So thank you guys for being here, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Namaste. Mwah.
Do you see beauty? Do you see pain? Oh, whatever you feel is what comes back again. Oh. Thank you so much for being here, my friends. Namaste. As you remember and reconnect with the light of unconditional love within your soul, don't forget to enjoy your life and have some fun along the way. Fall into the unknown. Download this track and other fun bonuses when you defuse the love bomb at www.innerworkcoaching.life.